Kia ora tātou, kia ora te whānau kakariki. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Every few decades, a big idea is born, and it takes form, and it grows organically, and it ends up changing history. The formation of a political party in 1972 that rejected completely the economics of growth and of more in favour of the economics of enough. Political party that said resources are finite, so we have to learn to share them, not just among people in this country, but among all countries. A political party that celebrated the freedom of the individual within a close and warm community. That was a very significant global event. It picked up on ideas that were milling around since the 60s all over the world, but it was the first place to give it political form, and that was here in New Zealand. And Green parties sprang up around the world. I still remember in the late 70s when the German Greens wrote to us and said, "We like your manifesto, can we use your policy for the German Greens?" People think they were the first in the world because they had proportional representation, so they were certainly the first in Parliament, but they drew on some of our experience. So thank you for being part of that movement. Thank you for making the effort to come today, and thank you for all the work that you've done in the 40 years in between. Today is a wonderful chance to meet old friends, to share memories, but it will be wasted if it is just a wallowing in nostalgia, because there is still a lot of work to do. This morning we'll remember, we'll celebrate, and we'll analyse the meaning of this movement and of the last 40 years. This afternoon we'll look forward. What do a bunch of elders around retirement age with 40 years of experience, a bit more free time, and grandchildren that they care about passionately, what do they want to contribute to the future? Norman and I have been your organising committee, and we've had a lot of fun putting this together. Special thanks has to go to Rachel Anderson-Smith, the amazing, super efficient, super cool, super organised and always helpful Rachel, who's enabled us to piggyback on all her organisation for the Greens conference, the venue, the food, the accommodation, even the registrations. And that has enormously reduced the load that Norm and I thought we were shouldering at the beginning. It's been very exciting to watch this list grow from a dozen names and emails that I had in my head to start with, to the ones that Norman added, and then Chris Patterson did some research. We checked the Greens database, and then it went viral, and we ended up with a mailing list of well over 100, and the registrations have come in so fast in the last few days that I understand we're over 80 now, and we still don't even quite have the final list, although the final list, or a list, is being put in a pile on the table just outside the door for you to pick up one for your folders. There are, of course, a lot of absent friends who really wanted to be here, and some of them have sent wonderful messages of support and greetings, and they are posted on the back wall for you to have a look at. So do have a look at the people who wanted to be with us that couldn't. And it may well be that when you go back to your regions after this, that they will demand some report on what happened, and it may well be that regions will want to hold their own event to remember the 40 years, and that is, of course, up to you. Some of you have indicated to Michael Brown that you would like to buy the DVD of photos, and Michael's now going to stand up. He's very recognisable, even without his hat, which he often wears. If you could fill in the order form in your folders and give it with $20 to Michael while you're here, it'll solve a lot of toing and froing afterwards, and he will send you a complete photographic record of everything that happened here. We also have Gerard here from a video company who is making a program for German TV, no less, on the origins of Green parties. So he's going to be doing some filming, and he's also going to be filming in Tasmania. It's Gerard over there with his team of people. We have TV3 here taking some footage. Norman will introduce Hugh later on, who's also... So there's cameras everywhere. So if you do not wish to be photographed, put your balaclava on now. Now, 10 o'clock till 12:45 is a long time, particularly when you get to be over 60. But the good news is that if you wish to leave the room, you do not have to put your hand up and ask. We're not going to take a break in the morning because you've all just had a cup of tea. But if you wish to leave the room, you just slip out and come back again in a nice, self-organising, anarchic values way. The emergency gathering point is just outside this building, between this building and the next one. And if the fire alarm sounds, that is what you need to do. So I'm going to kick off the nostalgia bit now with a memory of 1975, and then Tony and Norman are going to take us back to 1972.
Thanks, John Hanlon, for that.
A question of values, written.
Poltergeist. Thanks, John Hanlon, who kindly donated and wrote that song for us, but wasn't allowed to sing it because he was under contract to some other company. Some questions. How many people here are from the North Island? How many people from the South? Good heavy contingent. How many people here principally because of a Greens connection? Okay. And a values connection? Great, yeah, thank you. So, how many people here have ever been a candidate in one election? 2 elections? 3 elections? Are you still in counselling or have you come right? Okay. How many people here have held a national role of some kind, either convener, co-convener, leader, co-leader, deputy leader, or been involved with a national advertising or election campaign? How many have held such a role? Okay, thank you. And how many people have ever held the role of founder of the party? Okay. Well, I'm surprised I didn't see more hands go up because in the mid-70s we had a pretty strong socialist focus and a network within the party, and I think we passed the remit at one stage in the mid-70s that said that the position of founder would be circulated and rotated every 2 years in keeping with socialist principles. Yeah. So send me afterwards if you want to put your name on the list, because it's still that remit was never actually rescinded, so keep on going. Okay. Yes, the values song. So there's a story, obviously, which I'm sure many people have embellished the story of how that song came into being. And I must confess, to meet the needs of my own ego, I've been guilty over past years of embellishing stories, I'm sure, about the values story and how it came to pass. The bad news for me now is that I actually have up on stage someone who maybe has the true version of how the Values Party came into being. But maybe we're both suffering from some kind of recovered memory, and maybe the amalgam of the two stories which will be told might give you some basis for some part of the truth. How it started and what it meant to us at the time. So Tony and I will weave ourselves in and out of this presentation, but as we have done for the last 48 years. But before I do that, I'd like to take you on another nostalgia trip, particularly a bookend which I'll be talking about in a moment. And this is the compilation put together particularly by Tony of 10 minutes of past values, television and associated coverage. And from here we take it from the top.
Can we get copies of this?
Not sure. We'll let you know.
Economic growth means more productivity, more people, more pollution. It also means more money, so we're told. Can money buy us a new planet? Economic expansion is not the answer. The world's wealthiest nations can attest to that. New Zealand twice led the world in social reform. It can again. Are we to have a quantity of life or a quality of life? Let's preserve the good things we still have. People are more important than progress.
But I became so frustrated about midway through this year at the lack of alternatives in our political system that I just sort of felt I had to start a new party. It wasn't a totally negative thing. Labor, it seemed to me, wasn't really offering a viable alternative, but I also could see there is something new forming in society, which it seems to me does form the basis, or could form the basis for a new party. So I was really forced into this thing. It sounds awfully noble and all that, but I was so frustrated. I knew I wouldn't have a party to vote for this November. I wanted someone to start up a new political party saying the things we're saying, but no one had. Or no one did, so that's how I got in. Robin comes from Hastings, but he's vice president of the Canterbury University Students Association. This will be really good because McIntyre's been talking a lot lately about the need to stabilise population and economic growth, and if we put someone up in his seat, I think New Zealand should deliberately and consciously adopt a policy of zero population growth. Where the number of births roughly match the number of deaths. I think this should be the next major social advance in New Zealand. No other country in the world has adopted the goal of ZPG, although some have achieved it unconsciously. Now it seems to me if we can stabilise the population, we can also stabilise economic growth and thus reduce pressure on the environment. So first priority, stabilise population, then stabilise the economy. For example, at the present time, electricity demand in New Zealand is doubling every 10 years. By the end of the century, every creek and river in this country is going to be tampered with if we're to get the electricity that people want. So it seems to me that if we can stabilise these two things, it's going to contribute greatly to increasing the quality of life in New Zealand.
Well, I got into politics because it's the Values Party, and I have felt personally committed to the values that the Values Party upholds for so long that it just seemed to bring them all together, as it were. And that's really why politics. There was no candidate standing in Hiratonga where I wanted to vote, so I put myself in a position to be asked to stand, and was asked to stand.
Probably it's fair to say that the Values Party is trying to politicise a social movement and to socialise politics. Farther than that, I don't think anyone knows, excepting it seems to be important. And if it seems to be important, it seems to make it worth pursuing.
Your policies will seem to some to be not very practical, that you're generally too idealistic. They will. As some people have said, your policies are too idealistic. But I think this is a reflection of the fact that we haven't really had much idealism in New Zealand politics in the last 20 years. I think the people who say this to us, I think it's pretty clear that the mediocre and shallow goals of Labour and National have just about killed the faculty of imagination of the average New Zealander. He doesn't know what New Zealand is capable of. We're saying New Zealanders can reach out for a society like this for these goals, which I don't really regard as idealistic. I think they're quite realistic. Trevor, why get into politics, and why in particular the Values Party?
A general concern, I think, for the future. I suppose it sounds corny, but married with 2 children, I'm just concerned with the sort of future my children are going to have, the sort of country they're going to grow up in, and what appears to be happening to the country at the moment. That's more or less why politics in general. The Values Party specifically, because they do seem to be addressing themselves to the future with new answers, and perhaps a little bit radical, but we think, the type of answers and that is required for the problems that are happening and are going to happen.
In New Zealand at the present time, we've got a number of small parties, but practically all of them are very conservative. The Liberal Reform Party, the New Democrats, the Social Credit Party, they're all of the right. We might not necessarily be of the left in the traditional sense, but we are an activist party, so I think most of our votes will come from people who do desire social change.
It was only by chance encounter earlier this year that I happened to meet Tony Brunt and suddenly realised that here was a man who was actually starting to talk in terms which I could understand and see as the political sort of basis for the future. a change in emphasis away from the traditional parties, talking about things which I saw as being more important than some of the sort of issues the way that the traditional political parties have put them.
Well, I'd like to think we had a bright future. I'd like to see us getting involved in all sorts of social activities and doing it, sort of putting our ideas into practice so that we're not just a party that says things and doesn't do them.
I don't think we'll win this election, but maybe next time. I think this time we're educating rather than out to actually get into power. Although if we did win, it'd be very nice.
I think we'll have an effect, yes. Whether we'd ever, after this election, find ourselves in a position of power or not, I don't know. That would be most unlikely, I would think, but I think we will definitely have an effect.
I think that great social change seems to come in New Zealand in 40-year cycles. It was 40 years after this country really began developing in earnest that we had the great industrial reforms of the 1890s. New Zealand women were the first in the world to get the vote. It was 40 years after that that we had the great social reforms of the first Labour government. The pattern seems to be that New Zealand goes forward and then it consolidates, and whenever it goes forward it leads the world, and that third 40 years is almost up. I think New Zealand can lead the world again.
Economic growth means more productivity, more people, more pollution. It also means more money, so we're told. Can money buy us a new planet? Economic expansion is not the answer. The world's wealthiest nations can attest to that. New Zealand twice led the world in social reform. It can again. Are we to have a quantity of life or a quality of life? Let's preserve the good things we still have. People are more important than progress.
And titles coming up. Okay. Thank you, Tony. Great job putting that together. The story of how that groundbreaking TV ad came to be made was almost a metaphor for the campaign. Kind of rollicking out of control, what's happening, and Tony and I had blackmailed and bullied the New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation into giving us some TV time, and then the question was, well, what do we do with it? And almost literally, a knock on the door, and through came those two young filmmakers from the National Film Unit. Wouldn't it be great to be able to just say thanks to them today? Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, Hugh McDonald and Rob Ritchie, those two guys. Three days ago, somebody said to me, this should be videoed. 3 days to go, what do we do? Hopeless. So we sent out a reflective note, wouldn't it be a good idea, to a few selected people. And once again, Rob and Hugh are here recording for posterity. Guys, thank you. Yeah, so it was 48 years ago, not 40 years ago, that Tony and I began collaborating. We checked back and we realised that it was more than 48 years ago that a young first-year, thank you Ian, a young first-year cadet entered into the newsroom of the New Zealand Herald, watched from a distance by a very wise third-year cadet who had been there and seen it all and done that. And that was when I first met Tony, who came through the door to begin his career in journalism. I'm not saying he was geekish looking, because the word geekish I don't think had been invented then. But this began some years hanging out, playing around rugby together, and a few other escapades. So our roles on the rugby field were actually reversed in later political teamwork. In rugby, Tony did the hard yards and the forwards, and I was a flighty, flashy back that scored tries. The role of who did the hard work and who gets all the credit now has obviously been reversed in our political careers. Okay. Yes, I can even recall being Tony's bagman, going around friends and touting for money for his 1977 election campaign. Because Tony didn't actually disappear off the scene. He finished up as a Wellington city councillor, and in 1977, in his second term, topped the poll. So today we're actually bound by a mutual pact, but we can't go into too much detail about how some things happened, because let's just say we each know where the bodies are buried. In my case, the car bodies as well, but don't talk about the car parts, Tony. So over history, history they say is written by the winners, and in a way, when Tony disappeared a little earlier than I off the values scene, it turned out that I finished talking to more people and began to perhaps inadvertently put my version of how the party really started. So, for example, I recall talking to Christine Dan. Where's Christine? Oh, hi, Christine. Doing her PhD, and I told Christine a story about one of the catalysts for the creation of the Values Party, and my version went something like this: that Tony had gone back to university. He was studying political science with a view to having a career in the diplomatic corps, I think. And one of his professors there was a man called Murphy, I think a reasonably conservative, but a lovely man. And my memory of how it went was this, that Tony had begun to get into conflict with his professorial staff, because Tony hypothesised this. He said there was a gap in the political spectrum, that the Labour Party and the National Party were failing to represent an emerging set of ideals and principles and policies which the country needed. So there was no place on the spectrum. So Tony hypothesised there was a gap in the market, which I think had been particularly rejected by some of these people. So Tony, in his frustration, said, well, bugger you, it might not work in theory, but I'll show you how it works in practice. And that's how the Values Party came to be created. So Christine will have the opportunity, and Tony will have the opportunity, to either correct or rewrite the story that I've been pushing around for 30 odd years. So at that stage, I was a young IBM executive, working hard, doing all the right things, furthering my career, responding to what the establishment was expecting on me. I think I even voted National once. I suddenly realised, as I began to talk to Tony about New Zealand being in the grip of a new depression and how it was not meeting people's needs, I suddenly realised that I was one of the people that he had been talking about. And when Tony talked about this idea to create a new party, it first of all seemed a particularly ridiculous idea, but he talked and I drank, and Tony drank shandy and I drank other stuff, and as we talked into the night and at various venues over a reasonably extended bender, as it were, I decided I'd reached a tipping point in my life, and if Tony were going to start a political party, I would help him. Then came the question of the name of the party. Have you ever heard of a more ridiculous and inappropriate name than values, youth party, because no one over 35 would know what we're talking about, New Democrat or social something or other, but what a ridiculous name. Well, I told him so. I knew it would never last and never have any enduring value. And the rest they say is history. So, rather than go on now about how I tuned in and turned on and dropped out and became a farm labourer in the Wairarapa in the 73 and returned, was headhunted to organise the campaign in 75, I'm going to hand over to Tony shortly, but I do want to say that there was an extraordinary time in the middle between 73, 74, into 75, when the party devolved and disappeared, and would probably have disappeared without trace were it not for the efforts of Cathy Wilson, Catherine Benlin, Cathy, here with us. Well, I'm sure moral support from Douglas, and I know Dave Woodhams and others who basically held the fort in this hiatus, which actually prompted one party wit to say at one stage that if there are such a thing as UFOs, and we don't quite know about that, then the old cliche of if they arrive, take us to your leader, will have to be replaced with take us to your box number. So thank you, Doug and Cathy and Dave and others for keeping things going in that period. So here's the opportunity to basically pass over to Tony. Unfortunately for me, Tony has an extraordinary memory, and also he has access to a diary. So he remembers very carefully what actually happened. Fortunately for me, or unfortunately for him, my memory's still good enough that I do remember where some of his bodies are buried as well. So I'm hoping this might have some kind of a mitigating effect. So, and Christine may get the answer that she's been waiting for, and we may get another version that will serve us for the next 40 years about how it really happened. But in the meantime, I introduce to you the original, one and only and unreplaceable Tony Brunt.
After a build-up like that, even I'm anxious to hear what I've got to say. Thank you, Norman and Jeanette, for this lovely idea of organising this special event, and it's come together so well, so quickly. And thanks to Rachel in back office for the organisational work, the clerical work in the back. You know, I keep wanting to trot out the cliche, it just seems like yesterday, but it just seems like 40 years ago, actually. But despite that, I still remember all the fine people who I had contact with in 1972 and to an extent in 1973, and all the wonderful things we did together. It was a fantastic time. And I see people in the audience who were involved right at the start. I see people in the audience who were involved in that really difficult period from June, July, August, when the party didn't really exist, and it was just a guy sitting in his kitchen in Newtown pecking out on his typewriter a new manifesto and issuing press releases pretending that a massive new party was mushrooming in the country. And the reality didn't catch up with the story until about 5 or 6 months later. And I see plenty of people in the audience today who were there at the start. And there are, of course, people who are not here today. I was talking to one, Reg Clough, at his home in Queensland. I was talking by phone a couple of weeks ago, and Reg sends his very best. As you're all aware, Reg was the leader who, with Cathy as deputy leader, took the party over 5% in 1975. You know, no MMP, paradise lost. So, and of course there are some wonderful people who are no longer with us, who passed on, and I remember some lovely souls from the 72 campaign particularly, who I'd just like to mention briefly. Dennis Tyndall, who was the second ever Values Party candidate. He stood for Miramar. Dennis was an awesome guy, and he was killed in a plane crash in Africa some years ago. Robert Overend Sr., our oldest candidate in 1972, he stood in St Albans. His son is up here. David Hopkinson in Auckland. Went to school with David, he was a candidate. John R. Perkins, an American gentleman of senior years, who stood for us in Awarua, in South Otago. Bob Anderson, my mother, who was a great values supporter. And I've sort of felt the presence of some of them in the last few weeks when I've been thinking back to those days, and it would not surprise me at all if there are more people here today than meets the eye. Perfectly frank. You know, they and you caught a moment in time. It wasn't just me. People had the courage to just step out off the cliff and into space, and to become what I think were political early adopters. Early adopters who have really been justified by the course of history, I think. Early adopters who got things more right than wrong. And that wasn't easy to do, to step off the cliff like that in those days. You know, values was describing and promoting a radical program, a radical agenda, and it was out of sync with anything that had gone on in New Zealand politics before. I said in a message to the people from Nelson who had a Values 40th a couple of weeks ago that, you know, they can take some consolation from having got on modernity's biggest bandwagon when it was just the size of a skateboard. And I think that applies to you people as well. You know, we didn't know that it would turn out like this. It was a 50-50 call whether the values message was relevant in the years ahead, and it really wasn't until the mid-1980s and the late 1980s when the issue of greenhouse gas emissions and global warming was really confirmed that I think the message received some confirmation. Global warming, as we are all aware, it wasn't around in the 70s, it wasn't even thought of. The Limits to Growth study in 1972 in March had pollution as one of its 5 variables, but they saw pollution and other negative effects leading towards the collapse of life support systems on the planet in the latter part of this century if the business as usual model kept going. But they saw pollution as reducing birth rates, increasing death rates, affecting global food production. No one saw what was coming. And it's no comfort that something came along. I said to Norman when we were having lunch a couple of months ago, it was the first time we'd seen each other for many years, and he agreed, we both you had that sense in those days, and just an intuition that something was going to come along, something not so good was going to come along. And the fact that it did is no comfort, is it? It's no comfort, but at least you were some of the first people to ring the alarm bells. You were some of the first people to wave a red flag. Or should that be a green flag, perhaps, Jeanette? When Norman rang me and told me that he and Jeanette had agreed to hold this gathering, I went around to Chris Patterson's in Auckland to have a look at the 1975 values gallery program, and I hadn't seen it since the evening it was aired. I hadn't seen it again, and I must say, as I sat there watching it, I broke out in a sweat, and I got quite embarrassed with some of the things I was saying, at the naivety and simplicity of them. And my daughter was sitting beside me, and Chris and Marika were watching the screen, and fortunately no one was looking at me because steam was rising from me. And then I thought later as we were driving home, well, you know, don't be too hard on yourself, old guy, because, you know, you had to understand the political environment that existed in those days. You know, New Zealand was a po-faced, uptight society in those days that was affected by paralysis of its institutions, its attitudes, its news media perspectives, its social and political discourse. And it was a very frustrating time, I think, for people who wanted something different. I remember working on the Herald in Auckland, and budget night, every budget night, the big thing was, would the price of a packet of fags and the price of a jug of beer go up? And those were the headlines, the following day. Media dumbing down is not a recent phenomenon. The Values was formed in a window of opportunity, I think. We had an affluent and comfortable society in 1972. We had 2% unemployment. We'd had 4% economic growth per annum for about the prior decade. Education was free, including university education. There was no DPB. Superannuation was available at 60 with no question about sustainability. So they were special times, and we took advantage of that window, looking back, to talk about quality of life rather than standard of living. And I don't think that if New Zealand had been a struggling, socially hard-pressed society, obviously we could have perhaps done that, but we did. New Zealand was on the cusp of moving from really transforming itself from that type of society that I regarded as sterile to one that by the end of the 70s had become much freer, more diverse and much more flexible and more inspirational. And that was down in part, I think, to people like yourselves. My background, I had worked on the Herald for 5 years. I got a BA in political studies. I came down to Wellington to do a BA honours in that year in 1972. And I found myself sort of being affected by that strange phenomenon that existed in the world just for about 10 years, from the late 1960s to the late 1970s, when millions of young people rejected sort of machine values and found the urban environment impersonal and dehumanising. And that decade where that sensibility existed never recurred. It's never recurred. It was just that strange 10 years. Anyway, I was affected by it, and I found my nerves being rubbed raw here in Wellington. And simultaneously, I was doing a course at university on New Zealand futures and coming into contact with a lot of writers who were questioning some of the systems that were in place in society that had developed a mind of their own and were just steamrolling things like the environment and community. Writers like Charles Reich, The Greening of America, had a tremendous impact on me. Alvin Toffler, A Future Shock, René Dubos, So Human and Animal. So I could see these things coming together, and they were sort of, to me, they were explaining why I was feeling like I was. Well, it seemed that way. Plus, Norman has alluded to Professor Walter Murphy at Victoria University, who was taking me on a course in international relations and strategy, military strategy, and I just found his views very archaic. He'd come through the war. He was a lovely fellow, and but he felt we needed to have compulsory military training, a strong defence. We needed to have treaties, collective security, and this was driving me up the wall. And that's why, to me, one of the important elements in the 72 manifesto was the defence policy, where we did away with the defence. Not sure I 100% agree with that now, but anyway, so these things came together, and I was sitting in the university library at Vic one day thinking, look, why don't Kirk and Marshall start pulling some of this stuff out? And why isn't someone starting up a third party? And I'd been thinking this for some weeks, and then sort of it was like a light went off in my head, and it was, you are going to start this party. And I saw the future. I saw immediately that I would be dropping out almost from that day, that I was burning my bridges back to journalism, to possible diplomatic service, that I was going to be living on the bones of my behind for some months, that I would have to change from being an introvert to being someone who could present publicly. I saw all these things immediately, but I was just so filled with idealism that they didn't matter at all. And two things happened very quickly after that. Firstly, I met a young woman at a party called Dallas Oram, and I told her what I was going to do, and she said, "What are you going to call it?" And I said, "I'm going to call it the New Zealand Youth Party." And she said, "Oh, no. She was adamant. She said, "Look, you'll narrow the focus too much," because I didn't think anyone over the age of 30 back then was going to understand what the hell I was going to be talking about. And she said, "You cannot do that. You'll limit the appeal." And so I took that on board. Can you imagine meeting here today, 40th anniversary of the founding of the New Zealand Youth Party? Yeah, Monty Python moment, wouldn't it? Cool. And of course she was right. You know, our oldest candidate in 1972 was a gentleman who'd been born in 1907. You know, so she was right, I was wrong. The other thing that happened very quickly after that, probably just a matter of days, was I caught up with Norman Smith at the Duke of Edinburgh Hotel.
No, it's Britannia.
He says it was the Britannia Hotel.
This is a serious history.
This is a serious anomaly in history, but look, I've got the benefit of a diary here, which I kept in 1972. You can see it's a very full diary, but the only problem is I didn't start keeping it until some days after we met.
I only drank lime beer and I'd never go to that pub. Rest assured.
Anyway, Norman came along. I seem to feel that he had brought a fellow manager from IBM, Bob Overend, along. I could be wrong. I'm not sure. Anyway, I started to tell Norman what I was planning, what I had in mind, and Norman's got a phrase he's been using for the last 50 years, actually, to denote approval. I hear what you're saying. And he said this quite frequently. I started describing to him what I was going through and what I wanted to do, and what I wanted to do and what I was feeling. And I could see that I was just cutting right into this guy, cutting right into him. And man, he was just focused. And I was going not just into his head, but I could tell I was going into his heart as well. And that night, Norman became my first 100% convert. And he became, that night he became my right-hand man, and he put at our disposal his exceptional organisational skills and his exceptional enthusiasm and energy. And that was a lucky break. I think, my memory is that Bob Overend was there. I may or may not be wrong. But I know that when I first did the same thing to Bob, he was just a 70% convert. But he did come around and agreed to be a candidate for Wellington Central at that election. So those were the two things. The next thing, I'll move on to the very first meeting where we formed the party at Victoria University on May 30. May 30? Yeah.
Obviously, he refers to me in critical matters.
I had a long speech. I wasn't a particularly animated speaker in those days. It was sort of monologue stuff. And about 60 people turned up. I'd written an article for Salient, the Victoria University newspaper, and called the meeting. There'd been 4 weeks' notice, and I got there, about 60 people, quite a good turnout. Did my spiel for quite a long time. At the end, there seemed to be a reasonable response, except there were two quite fundamental attacks that came in against me, one from the left and one from what you might call the pragmatic centre, and which reflected perhaps a wider sentiment in the community, as we discovered over the next few months. On the left, a young man called Peter Wilson, a radical Marxist, attacked me for trying to get away from the class system, the class analysis of society. You know, we said the forces at work in society that were accommodating people to them rather than the other way around were indifferent to class. And he felt really threatened by this. So he said, look, you know, you've got to stick with socialism and class. And he was really threatened. The other objection was more silver-tongued. It came from a young environmentalist on the rise. And he said, look, I agree with 100% of what Tony has said here tonight. He said, but he's going about it the wrong way. He needs to be joining one of the two major political parties and working from within. A legitimate viewpoint. And he spoke like this for a while, and then he turned to the audience and he said, look, and actually he said to me, he said, look, you've got no members, you've got no resources, you've got no profile, you've got no reputation. And then he turned to the audience and he said, is there actually anyone here tonight who is going to help Tony start this party? And there was a long silence. And then a young man stood up at the back. I didn't know him, jeans and jacket, long hair. He said, actually, I'm going to help him start the party. And that broke the logjam. And quite a few people then put up their hands. And at the end of the night, people came up and wrote their names in the book. And we formed a small committee. But the paradoxical thing was I never saw that young man again for 5 months. But it turned out his name was David Parkin, and he lived in the Waitakaries with Tim Shadbolt and Tim's wife Marion and their kids, and another man called Leo and his wife Jill. And Dave had read the article in Salient when he was in Auckland, and he had hitchhiked all the way down from Auckland to attend that meeting. I tried to dig him up in Auckland last week to tell him what was going to happen down here and to get down here, but I couldn't find him. Tim will probably know where he lives, but you know, finally an acknowledgement and a thank you for David Parkin, the man who broke the silence. You know. Are we out of time? How are we going for time?
How are you going?
Okay, just so after that I stood for Island Bay, announced my candidacy for the Island Bay electorate. I travelled down to Christchurch and had a meeting or two in at the university, I think at the Island campus. Gary was one of the first people who came up. Stand up, Gary. Gary was one of the first people who came up at that meeting and wrote his name in the book to be a volunteer to help start the party. Then I went down to Dunedin and did the same thing. We got a committee formed and we got what turned out to be the deputy leader, Jeff Neal, lecturer in economics and industrial management at Otago University. And went to Auckland, had a meeting. Sue, were you at that meeting? No. You weren't? Was she? Yes, that's right. Yeah. Sue was in a very, very early on, Sue and Reg, very early on in Auckland. Manifesto. Intercontinental Ballroom. Whoa, wild meeting. Good man. Intercontinental Ballroom. Wow, that was a hell of a meeting. That was sort of ranked very close to the revival meeting we had in the Wellington Town Hall here. That was just something else, you know. That was a special occasion. And then we had the gallery program, which you've seen bits of it tonight, and that was 5 weeks before the election. That really put us on the map. And after that, our candidate total just rocketed up. Just a final word on Hugh and Rob Ritchie and the work they did. There were 4 guys who actually knocked on my door that day. And we didn't know how the hang we were going to use this TV time. We had about 6 one-minute slots and a couple of 10-minute slots. And we had got that because we had said we would have more than 15 candidates. That was at the time when we had about 6. Norm actually went and told Lionel Skeets, Director General of the NZBC, that we would have 25 candidates. And I nearly fell on the ground laughing when he said that. But so Skeets had given us that allocation based on 25. After the gallery program, the numbers went up to 42. And so we went back to Skeets. Hugh McDonald said, look, this is a brilliant ad. You've got to get more than 5 or 6 slots on national TV for this. I remember that, Hugh. Stop nodding your head. And so we went back to Skeets. Norman went back to a chap called Rowlandson and tried to negotiate more, but they stonewalled. They said, no, that's it. I went to the chairman of the NZBC's, Lieutenant General Thornton, and tried to nail him, but he was consistently unavailable. So then I went back to Skeets, and I had a long talk, 2 long talks with Skeets. My diary says so. Sorry. And in the end he said, no, finish, you're not having anything. I said, this is going to look really bad in the press. I said, I'm going to make a press release today pointing out the inequity of what you've just done. Half an hour later, we got a call back. And they said, we've increased your allocation. We'll give you another 5 slots, Hugh. So I think in the end we got about 10 or 12 slots on national TV. And that everyone agreed that was the best TV ad of the campaign. It's got no grey hair on it, has it? It's fantastic. You could put it on today, man. Okay, production values are a bit wanting, but man, that's still contemporary. Anyway, that's my version of how the party started. Thank you.
There is a slightly longer version of that at the end of the campaign. Brian Edwards wrote a book called Right Out, and he solicited chapters from a whole lot of people. And Tony wrote a chapter, and that chapter is photocopied and it's down the back, along with all sorts of other memorabilia, including, if you're trying to decipher what is on the front of the program, that is one of the first pages of the original typed draft with handwritten amendments. So if you watch very carefully, you'll see something there about assisting Pacific Islanders. That's written down the bottom, and so on. So if you want to see the real original version of the foolscap typed on Tony's, what did your diary say? Was it on an Olivetti or a Remington, Tony? On a Remington, yeah, okay. So that's also down the back. Okay, so it behooves me now to move into the next session by introducing Dave Woodhams. Dave has chaired more Values Party meetings than Green Party members have had lentil soup, I think. I think he was seriously in retirement, but we pulled him out for this next session in which he's going to convene and invite people just to, it's not about us, and so we have a series of sessions. Now, I'm not sure how long Dave is going to allow people to talk for, but we're going to institute a little refereeing system to try and keep people to time. So, I'm sure many of you do know Dave, so please welcome Dave Woodhams. Do you want to explain the referee?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Norm. I must say, when I replied to the initial email offer to chair a session, it feels a bit like a hospital pass. Could I first of all have an indication of how many people would like to spend 2 minutes or less saying what they've done in a values way since 1980, I'm sorry. Raise a hand, please, so I can count you.